The trolley is already moving. It is not drifting. It is not slowing. It is racing forward at 60 miles an hour, metal screaming against steel, momentum already committed to a destination that cannot be reached without consequence. The track ahead is straight, narrow, and unmistakable. 5 men are working on it. They are not looking up. They do not see what is coming. There is no ambiguity about what will happen next. If nothing changes, all 5 will die. You are the one at the controls. You pull the brake lever. Nothing happens. The mechanism has failed. The weight of the trolley, its speed, the laws of physics, none of them care about your intentions. You feel the unmistakable sensation of helplessness, the kind that arrives when responsibility remains even as control disappears. And then you notice something else. To the right, branching off from the main line, is a side track. At the end of that track stands a single worker. 1 man, 1 body, 1 life. The steering wheel still works. You could turn the trolley. You could redirect its path. You could choose. This is where the assumption enters. Faced with this choice, most people respond immediately. They do not deliberate for long. They do not request additional information. They do not ask for a legal brief or a philosophical treatise. They answer from instinct, from moral reflex. They say the same thing again and again across cultures, classrooms, and generations. Turn the trolley. Better that 1 should die than 5. This response feels not only intuitive, but obvious. It feels like common sense elevated to moral clarity. Numbers matter. Lives matter. And more lives matter more. To allow 5 people to die when you could prevent it by sacrificing 1 feels like a failure of basic moral responsibility. This belief is not presented as theory. It is not introduced as ideology. It arrives disguised as practicality, as necessity, as realism. It sounds like something adults say when confronted with hard truths about the world. It sounds like maturity. In desperate situations, you do what you have to do. The power of this assumption lies in how little it asks of us at first. It does not require us to deny the tragedy. It does not pretend the outcome is good. It simply claims that among bad options, some are less bad than others, and that morality consists in choosing the least terrible path available. 1 death instead of 5. The assumption does not celebrate violence. It frames it as unavoidable. It does not glorify sacrifice. It presents it as arithmetic, a calculation forced upon us by circumstances beyond our control. The trolley is already moving. The workers are already there. Someone will die. The only remaining question is, how many? This framing is crucial. It shifts moral responsibility away from the creation of the situation and onto its management. You did not build the trolley. You did not lay the track. You did not place the workers in harm's way. You were simply the last person in the chain, the one forced to decide how the damage will be distributed. And because the harm is framed as inevitable, choosing the outcome with fewer deaths feels not only permissible but required. To refuse to act begins to look like a moral failure, like cowardice, like hiding behind inaction while preventable deaths occur. In this way, the assumption quietly transforms killing into saving. You are no longer the agent of a death. You are the agent of 4 lives spared. The single life lost becomes a tragic byproduct, not the point of the action. The language shifts accordingly. You are not choosing to kill 1 person. You are choosing to save 5. This distinction matters more than it first appears, because once accepted, the assumption does not remain confined to hypothetical trolleys. It travels. It migrates. It embeds itself in how societies justify policies, how leaders defend decisions, how institutions explain collateral damage. It becomes a moral lens through which sacrifice is rendered meaningful by scale. History is filled with moments where this logic is invoked. Bombing campaigns justified by the claim that ending a war sooner will save more lives overall. Emergency decisions where individual rights are suspended to preserve social stability. Calculations where some are knowingly exposed to harm so that others may be protected. In each case, the same structure appears. The harm is regrettable but necessary. The numbers compel the choice. The alternative is worse. The assumption reassures us that morality can survive tragedy if we keep our eyes on the totals. But even within the trolley case itself, something else is happening beneath the surface. Notice how quickly the single worker disappears from view. He's not named, he's not described. We do not know his age, his family, his history. He exists in the scenario primarily as a number, a unit in a calculation. 1 instead of 5. This abstraction is not accidental, it is essential to the assumption's power. If we linger too long on the individuality of the one, the arithmetic begins to feel colder. If we imagine his face, his voice, the interruption of his life, the simplicity of the numbers becomes harder to accept. The scenario encourages us not to look too closely. It asks us to think in aggregates, and most of us comply. When asked to explain why they would turn the trolley, people often reach for language that reinforces this structure. They speak of fairness, of minimizing harm, of responsibility to the greatest number. They rarely say, "I am willing to kill this man." They say, "I can't let 5 people die when I could prevent it." This distinction is doing enormous moral work. It allows the act to feel less like violence and more like triage, less like murder and more like management. The trolley becomes a natural disaster that must be redirected, like floodwaters or a wildfire, rather than a weapon being aimed. And in this framing, refusal to act feels morally suspect. To keep the trolley on its original course, to let it kill 5 rather than 1, begins to look like moral indifference, like clinging to personal purity at the expense of others' lives, like valuing your own sense of innocence over the real suffering of others. This is why, in polls and classrooms, only a small minority choose not to turn the trolley. Those who refuse often struggle to explain themselves. Their position sounds brittle in the face of urgency. It sounds like an evasion of responsibility. The majority looks at them and wonders how anyone could stand by and allow 5 deaths when 1 could have been spared. The assumption has already done its work. It has established the moral baseline. It has defined what counts as reasonable. Those who reject it must now justify themselves against the weight of common sense. And yet, this confidence rests on something fragile. It rests on the idea that the moral relevance of an action lies primarily in its outcome, that what matters most is the state of the world after the decision is made. How many are alive? How many are dead? How much suffering exists in total? This way of thinking feels natural because it mirrors how we evaluate success and failure in many other domains. We measure progress in numbers. We assess policies by outcomes. We rank choices by efficiency. But morality is not engineering. And the trolley problem, simple as it seems, is already straining the boundaries of this assumption. Because embedded within it is a quiet transformation of agency. The moment you turn the wheel, you are no longer merely allowing harm to occur. You are redirecting it. You are selecting its target. The death that follows is no longer just something that happened. It is something that happened because of your intervention. The assumption asks us to accept this transformation without resistance. It asks us to believe that intentional redirection of harm is morally equivalent to allowing harm to proceed, as long as the numbers improve. that choosing who dies can be justified by choosing how many die. At first, this seems reasonable, even compassionate, but the trolley has not yet stopped, and the track ahead is about to split again. Because if numbers are all that matter, then the distinction between killing and letting die should not matter either. If outcomes alone determine morality, then any action that produces a better balance of lives saved should be acceptable, regardless of how directly it involves us in the harm. This implication has not yet been tested, not in this first case. Here the violence feels indirect. The trolley does the killing. You merely steer. The assumption remains intact. For now. The confidence with which most people turn the trolley does not come from nowhere. It rests on a way of thinking that is older than the scenario itself, a framework so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. It is the habit of judging actions by their results, of measuring right and wrong by what they produce in the world rather than by what they are in themselves. In the trolley case, this framework feels not only natural but necessary. Someone will die. That fact is fixed. Morality, under these conditions, appears to demand calculation rather than purity. If suffering cannot be eliminated, it should at least be minimized. If death cannot be avoided, it should at least be reduced. This is the moral logic that sustains the assumption. It treats the world as a field of consequences. Actions are inputs, outcomes are outputs. The ethical task is to choose the input that produces the best overall state of affairs. Fewer deaths, less pain, more lives preserved. Within this system, intention matters far less than effect. What counts is not how the harm comes about, but how much harm exists at the end. The moral ledger is balanced by totals. This mode of reasoning did not originate in philosophy classrooms. It emerged from practical life, from governance, from the management of scarce resources under pressure. Leaders, generals, doctors, and administrators have long been forced to make decisions where not everyone can be saved. Over time, a way of justifying those decisions took shape. Numbers became moral evidence. If a policy saved thousands but harmed hundreds, it could be defended. If a decision ended a war sooner at the cost of civilian lives, it could be justified. If a risky intervention endangered a few to protect many, it could be framed as responsible leadership. The trolley problem compresses this logic into a single, stark moment. It removes uncertainty. It removes politics. It removes time. What remains is the skeleton of the reasoning itself. 5 lives versus 1. In this stripped-down form, the system reveals its appeal. It promises clarity where emotion threatens paralysis. It offers a rule that can be applied consistently, regardless of how uncomfortable the outcome feels. It reassures us that moral responsibility does not disappear simply because circumstances are tragic. Within this framework, refusing to act becomes morally suspect. If you could have reduced harm but chose not to, you are no longer innocent. You are complicit in the worse outcome. The system does not allow you to hide behind inaction. Doing nothing is itself a choice, one that allows greater harm to occur. This is why, within this way of thinking, neutrality is often condemned. To stand aside while preventable suffering unfolds is to fail a moral test. The system demands engagement, even when engagement means getting one's hands dirty. This demand is part of its power. It aligns morality with responsibility. It tells us that to be moral is to take ownership of outcomes, not to retreat into personal cleanliness. It appeals to a sense of seriousness about the world, a refusal to indulge in moral gestures that do nothing to alleviate real suffering. In many contexts, this feels undeniably right. Emergency medicine operates on similar logic. Triage prioritizes those most likely to survive. Disaster response focuses on saving the greatest number, not on treating everyone equally. Public health policies routinely balance individual risk against population-level benefit. These practices are not seen as cruel, they are seen as necessary. The trolley problem borrows their authority. It asks us to imagine ourselves as the person forced to allocate harm under conditions we did not create. It frames the choice as an extension of duties we already accept in other domains. If we trust doctors to make such decisions, why not ourselves? And so, the assumption settles in comfortably. But beneath its surface lies a deeper claim, one that has not yet been made explicit. The system assumes that all lives can be weighed on the same scale, that one life can be meaningfully compared to another.
That moral value is additive.
5 units of life outweigh 1 unit of life, in the same way that $5 outweigh $1. This assumption is rarely stated outright, but it is doing essential work. Without it, the arithmetic collapses. Without it, the choice between 1 and 5 loses its obviousness. The system depends on the idea that lives are commensurable, that they can be counted, summed, and compared without remainder. In everyday life, we act as though this is true. We speak of casualty numbers, we calculate risk, we accept trade-offs, but we do so often without confronting what this implies. To accept the trolley logic is to accept that moral loss can be minimized through calculation, that tragedy can be managed even if it cannot be avoided, that the moral world, like the physical one, obeys principles of optimization. This is an appealing vision. It offers order in chaos. It suggests that even when circumstances are cruel, reason can still guide us toward better outcomes. Yet the system's elegance depends on keeping certain questions out of view.
It does not ask who the one person is.
It does not ask how the death occurs. It does not ask what it means to choose a person as the means by which others are saved. It does not linger on the experience of the one who dies. These omissions are not flaws in the system. They are features. By abstracting away from the details of agency and experience, the system preserves its clarity. By focusing on totals rather than persons, it avoids moral paralysis. By treating harm as a quantity rather than an act, it keeps decision-making possible. But abstraction always comes at a cost. The more we reduce moral situations to numbers, the more we risk losing sight of the individuals who make up those numbers. The system assumes that this loss is acceptable, perhaps even unavoidable, if we are to act at all. At this stage, most people accept that cost without protest. The trolley case feels too clean to resist. The harm is mechanical. The victims are faceless. The choice is instantaneous. The system performs well under these conditions. It produces an answer that feels right.
But the system has not yet been asked to confront its own implications. It has not yet been forced to operate in situations where the harm is no longer indirect, where the agent is no longer merely redirecting a force, where the abstraction begins to break down. Those tests are coming. Because if morality truly resides only in consequences, then the method by which those consequences are achieved should not matter. Killing and letting die should be morally equivalent if they produce the same outcome. Using a person as a means should be acceptable if it results in a better overall state of the world. The system, if it is to remain coherent, must accept these conclusions. The trolley is still moving, and the next situation will no longer allow us to hide behind steering wheels and runaway vehicles. It will force us to confront what it means to actively involve ourselves in harm, not as managers of disaster, but as its direct agents. Only then will we see whether the assumption can survive its own logic. The moment the trolley scenario changes, the certainty begins to crack. The numbers have not changed. 5 lives are still at risk. 1 life can still be sacrificed to save them. The arithmetic remains intact. And yet, when the situation is altered only slightly, confidence collapses. This time you are no longer inside the trolley. You are standing on a bridge above the track, watching as the same runaway car hurtles toward the same 5 workers. The brakes still do not work. The outcome is still certain. 5 deaths are imminent. You feel the same helplessness until you notice the man standing beside you. He is leaning over the railing. He is large enough that if he fell onto the track, his body would stop the trolley. The physics are clear. The result is guaranteed. Push him, and he will die. But the 5 below will live. Nothing else has changed. The numbers are identical. The certainty is identical. The urgency is identical. And yet, almost everyone refuses. The hands that rose confidently in the first scenario stay down now. The same people who insisted that it was morally obvious to sacrifice 1 for 5 suddenly recoil. They hesitate. They protest. They search for reasons, often struggling to articulate them clearly. Something feels wrong. This reaction is not subtle. It is not marginal. It is overwhelming. The majority that once agreed fractures instantly. The principle that felt unshakable moments earlier now seems disturbingly fragile. What happened? At first, people reach for explanations that try to preserve the original assumption. They say the difference lies in action versus inaction. In the first case, they argue, the trolley was already on its way. You merely redirected it. In the second case, you would be actively killing someone who would otherwise not be involved. But this distinction begins to blur under scrutiny. Turning the steering wheel is an action. Pushing the man is an action. In both cases, a conscious decision directly leads to a person's death. If consequences alone determine morality, then the manner of involvement should not matter. Others point to proximity. Pushing someone with your own hands feels different from pulling a lever or turning a wheel. The physical intimacy of the act seems to carry moral weight. But again, the system that sustained the assumption does not recognize such distinctions. Physical distance does not change the outcome. Hands or wheels, bodies or mechanisms, the result is still 1 dead, 5 alive. Some say the man on the bridge is an innocent bystander, not already part of the situation. But the worker on the sidetrack did not volunteer to be there either. He did not consent to be a sacrifice. He is just as innocent. Each attempt to explain the difference runs into the same problem. The original logic cannot account for the reaction. The discomfort people feel is not about miscalculation. It is not about uncertainty. It is not about risk. It is about the nature of the act itself, about what it means to intentionally use another human being as a tool. In the bridge scenario, the abstraction collapses. The man is no longer a number at the end of a track. He is beside you. He has a body you must touch, a weight you must push, a death you must cause directly. The moral distance that made the first decision feel manageable disappears, and with it, the confidence that numbers are all that matter. This is the first fracture in the system. It reveals that many people are not, in fact, pure consequentialists, even when they believe they are, even when they speak the language of outcomes and totals. When faced with a situation that requires direct violence against an individual, something else asserts itself. People begin to speak of murder. They say, that would be killing him. They say, I couldn't do that. They say, it feels categorically wrong. The word categorical appears spontaneously, even if the theory behind it is not yet clear. This reaction is not driven by emotion alone. It reflects a moral intuition that certain acts carry a special kind of wrongness, independent of what they produce. That pushing a person to his death is not merely one bad outcome among others, but a violation of something fundamental. The system that sustained the assumption struggles here because it was built to evaluate states of the world, not relationships between persons. It knows how to count lives, but it does not know how to account for agency, intention, or respect. The bridge scenario forces these issues into view. It raises a question the trolley driver never had to face so directly. Am I allowed to make someone into a means for saving others? Am I allowed to decide that this person's body will be used to stop a machine? The system offers an answer. Yes, if the numbers improve. But the answer no longer convinces. This is why people search for distinctions, even awkward ones. They are trying to reconcile two judgments that now stand in tension. They want to keep the original principle while explaining why it suddenly feels inapplicable. But the more they try, the more strained the explanations become. Eventually, some admit what the scenario is forcing them to see. The problem is not the numbers. The problem is the act.
Once this realization surfaces, the confidence of the first case looks less like moral clarity and more like a special exception made possible by distance, mechanism, and abstraction. The system worked because it did not have to confront its own implications. Now it does. And it does not emerge unscathed. Because if it is wrong to push the man, then outcomes cannot be the whole story. Something besides totals must matter. Something about how we treat individuals, about what we do to them, not just what results from our actions. The fracture widens further as similar patterns appear elsewhere. When the scenario shifts to medicine, people once again accept sacrificing one to save many, until the sacrifice requires actively killing a healthy person. When the harm becomes direct, intentional, and personal, the system falters again. Each time the same structure appears. When harm is indirect, impersonal, or mediated by systems, people accept consequentialist reasoning. When harm becomes intimate, deliberate, and embodied in a specific person, they resist. This pattern cannot be dismissed as inconsistency or weakness. It reveals something deep about moral judgment. People do not merely care about outcomes. They care about what they are doing to one another. The first fractures are now visible. The assumption that once felt unbreakable is no longer secure. It has not yet collapsed, but it is under strain. The trolley problem has done its work. It has exposed a fault line between two ways of thinking about morality that cannot be easily reconciled. On one side stands the logic of consequences. On the other stands a growing sense that some actions are forbidden, no matter how beneficial their outcomes might be. The next step will push this tension to its breaking point, because the next cases will not be hypothetical. They will not be clean. They will not allow the system to retreat into abstraction. They will involve real bodies, real deaths, and real decisions made under desperation. And the question will no longer be whether the system feels uncomfortable. It will be whether it can survive at all. The system finally begins to fail when the distance disappears completely. Until now, the scenarios have allowed a kind of moral insulation, a steering wheel, a lever, a body seen from above. Even when discomfort arose, it could still be explained away as hesitation about method rather than principle. But the next cases strip away that protection. This time, you are a doctor. 6 patients arrive at the emergency room following a catastrophic accident. 5 have serious but treatable injuries. 1 is critically injured and will require your full attention for the entire day. If you devote yourself to saving that one life, the 5 will die. If you focus on the 5, the critically injured patient will die. There is no malice here, no violence, no exploitation, only scarcity of time and attention. Once again, the majority choose to save the 5. Here, the system seems to recover. The consequentialist logic fits comfortably. Medicine itself often operates on this principle. Resources are limited. Outcomes must be prioritized. No one accuses the doctor of murder for choosing the 5, but then the case shifts, just slightly. Now you are not an emergency physician, you are a transplant surgeon. 5 patients are dying.
Each needs a different organ to survive. You have no donors. In the next room is a healthy man who came in for a routine checkup. He is asleep. If you kill him and remove his organs, the 5 will live. Suddenly, the system collapses completely. Almost no one accepts this as morally permissible. The reaction is immediate and forceful. The arithmetic is not changed. 5 lives are still at stake. 1 life can still save them. But now the act is unmistakable. This would be murder. The consequentialist framework offers no internal way to reject this conclusion. If outcomes are all that matter, then harvesting organs should be not only allowed but required. Yet our moral judgment recoils. At this point, people begin to articulate something they had only felt before. Certain actions are wrong in themselves, not because of what they lead to, but because of what they are.
Killing an innocent person in order to use his body as a resource violates a moral boundary that numbers cannot cross. Even saving 5 lives does not make it acceptable. The collapse becomes undeniable when the discussion turns to a real historical case. In 1884, the British yacht Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic. 4 survivors escaped in a lifeboat. The captain, Dudley, the first mate, Stevens, a sailor, Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy, Richard Parker. They were adrift for weeks with almost no food or water. As days passed, Parker grew gravely ill. On the 19th day, Dudley proposed a lottery to decide who would die so the others could survive. Brooks refused. No lots were drawn. The next day, Dudley killed Parker with a knife. The 3 survivors fed on his body for several days until they were rescued. The facts were never in dispute. At trial, Dudley and Stevens argued necessity. They claimed that what they did was terrible but unavoidable. Better that 1 should die so that 3 could live. The argument is hauntingly familiar. The same arithmetic, the same logic, the same appeal to desperation, and yet most people judge their actions to be morally wrong. Some defend them. They speak of survival, of starvation, of doing what had to be done. They argue that extreme necessity dissolves ordinary moral rules, that in such conditions, moral judgment itself becomes inappropriate. Others reject this entirely. They insist that there is no circumstance in which one human being is entitled to take the life of another, that necessity explains behavior but does not justify it, that desperation may excuse, but it does not make right. Then new distinctions emerge. What if Parker had consented? What if they had drawn lots? What if the procedure had been fair? With each modification, more people soften. A lottery feels less like murder and more like tragic sacrifice. Consent appears to transform the act. Fairness seems to confer legitimacy. But even here, resistance remains. Some insist that consent under such conditions is meaningless. Others argue that no agreement can authorize killing. Still others point out that once killing is allowed, the logic has no natural stopping point. These arguments expose the final weakness of the system. Consequentialist reasoning can explain why people act as they do. It can explain desperation, fear, and calculation. But it cannot explain why certain actions feel forbidden, even when they promise better outcomes. It has no language for dignity. No account of inviolability. No way to say, this must not be done, only this produces worse results. The collapse is now complete. The original assumption that morality consists in minimizing harm can no longer carry the weight placed upon it. It breaks under the pressure of cases where harm must be inflicted intentionally, directly, and personally. At this point, something else begins to take shape. A different way of thinking about morality, one that does not begin with outcomes at all. One that focuses instead on duties, rights, and the moral limits of action.
one that insists that some lines must not be crossed, even for the sake of saving lives.
The system that sustained the assumption has failed its most difficult tests. What remains is the question of what should replace it. Once the system collapses, it does not disappear quietly. It leaves behind questions that refuse to settle, questions that demand a different kind of moral vocabulary. The language of outcomes, lives saved, deaths avoided, suffering minimized, no longer seems sufficient. Something essential has been left out, and now it must be named. People begin to speak not of numbers, but of limits. They say there are certain things one must not do, no matter how dire the circumstances. Certain actions that cross a line beyond which moral justification cannot go. The idea takes shape gradually, often haltingly, but with growing confidence. Killing an innocent person is wrong. Using a human being merely as a means is wrong. Some acts are forbidden, even if they would produce better results. This way of thinking does not deny tragedy. It does not pretend that the world is gentle or fair. It simply insists that morality is not exhausted by calculation, that there is more at stake in human action than the state of the world it produces. At the center of this shift is a renewed focus on the individual. In the trolley case, the individual had been reduced to a unit. In the bridge case, he reappeared as a person. In the transplant case, he became unmistakably a victim. In the lifeboat, he was a boy with a name, a history, and a body that others decided to use. This return of the individual changes everything. Once the person is seen not as a variable, but as a bearer of moral standing, the logic of sacrifice begins to look dangerous. If each person possesses a certain inviolability, then no amount of benefit to others can override it. This is the core insight of categorical moral reasoning. It holds that morality is grounded not in outcomes, but in principles that apply universally. These principles do not bend under pressure. They do not weigh one life against another. They set boundaries on what may be done, regardless of the consequences. Within this framework, the wrongness of pushing the man off the bridge does not depend on how many lives would be saved. It depends on what the act expresses. A decision to treat a person as a tool. Similarly, the horror of harvesting organs from an innocent patient does not arise from miscalculation. It arises from the recognition that such an act violates the moral status of the person being killed. The lifeboat case brings this insight into sharp relief. Those who condemn Dudley and Stevens often do so not because they deny the desperation of the situation, but because they reject the idea that desperation grants moral license. They insist that necessity explains behavior without justifying it. Even when sympathy is extended, judgment remains. This distinction matters. To understand is not to excuse. To feel compassion is not to surrender moral standards. Categorical reasoning allows for mercy without abandoning principle. But the transition from outcome-based thinking to principle-based thinking is not simple. As soon as categorical limits are asserted, new questions arise. Where do these limits come from? Why should killing be absolutely forbidden? What gives individuals this inviolable status? Some answer in terms of rights. Human beings, they argue, possess fundamental rights simply by virtue of being human. These rights do not depend on social benefit or collective welfare. They are not granted by governments or justified by outcomes. They are inherent. Others ground the limits in dignity. To kill an innocent person, even for good reasons, is to deny their status as a moral equal. It is to place oneself above them, deciding that their life exists for the sake of others. Still others point to consent as a possible bridge between these views. If a person freely agrees to sacrifice themselves, does that change the moral picture? Does consent transform killing into permissible self-sacrifice? The appeal of this idea is strong.
Consent seems to restore agency. It allows the individual to choose rather than be chosen. It appears to respect autonomy even in tragic circumstances. This is why, in the lifeboat case, the idea of a lottery gains traction.
A fair procedure, agreed to in advance, feels morally different from an arbitrary execution. It spreads the burden of risk evenly. It avoids singling out the weakest, and yet, even here, doubt remains. Is consent meaningful under extreme duress? Can a choice made under starvation truly be free? Does agreement to a procedure justify whatever outcome it produces? Some argue that consent under such conditions is inevitably coerced, shaped by desperation rather than genuine autonomy. Others worry that once killing is allowed by agreement, moral protections erode quickly. If one person can consent to die for others, what prevents pressure, expectation, or moral blackmail from taking hold? What begins as voluntary sacrifice can slide into obligation. These concerns reveal the tension at the heart of moral adaptation. People want to preserve the humanity of individuals without denying the reality of tragic choice. They want moral rules that are firm enough to protect the vulnerable, yet flexible enough to acknowledge desperation. No single principle resolves this tension completely. What emerges instead is a recognition of moral complexity. Consequentialist reasoning captures something real about responsibility in a world of scarcity. Categorical reasoning captures something real about respect for persons. Neither can simply replace the other without loss. This recognition marks a turning point. The discussion is no longer about finding the one correct answer to a thought experiment. It is about understanding the kinds of moral reasons we invoke, the values we prioritize, and the limits we are willing to accept. People begin to see that moral disagreement is not always a matter of confusion or ignorance. It can reflect genuine conflict between values that cannot be fully reconciled. Saving lives matters. Respecting persons matters. Sometimes these commitments collide. The recognition of this collision does not resolve it, but it does something equally important. It forces us to acknowledge that moral reasoning is not mechanical. It cannot be reduced to formulas. It requires judgment, reflection, and an awareness of what is at stake beyond outcomes. At this stage, the discussion has moved far from the trolley. What began as a simple question about switching tracks has become an inquiry into the foundations of moral life, into what we owe one another, into the kinds of reasons that can justify harming others, if any. The final step is to ask what all of this means beyond the classroom. Because these moral frameworks are not merely academic, they shape laws, policies, and institutions. They inform how societies punish, forgive, and justify violence. They influence how citizens understand their obligations to one another. The consequences of this inquiry are not theoretical. They are lived. By the time the final questions surface, it becomes clear that the trolley problem was never really about trolleys. It was a device, a way of drawing attention to patterns of reasoning that quietly govern moral and political life. What looked at first like an abstract puzzle has revealed itself as a map of competing moral logics, each with consequences that reach far beyond hypothetical tracks and runaway cars. At stake is not simply how we judge extreme cases, but how we understand moral responsibility itself. The consequentialist approach, which guided the initial assumption, offers a powerful promise. It claims that moral reasoning can be practical, results-oriented, and responsive to real suffering. It insists that we take responsibility for outcomes rather than retreat into moral self-protection. In a world marked by scarcity, risk, and unavoidable harm, this promise is deeply attractive. This way of thinking has shaped modern governance. Public policy routinely relies on cost-benefit analysis. Legislators weigh lives against resources, safety against freedom, individual risk against collective welfare. Military planners calculate acceptable losses.
Public health officials impose restrictions that harm some in order to protect many. Courts balance competing rights by estimating social impact. None of this is accidental. The logic that makes turning the trolley feel obvious is the same logic that underwrites much of modern institutional decision-making.
It is the logic of management, optimization, and scale. It treats moral problems as engineering challenges, tragic but solvable through better calculation. And yet, the fractures revealed by the later cases expose a danger. If morality is reduced entirely to outcomes, then there is no principled barrier against using individuals as instruments. There is no internal limit to what may be done, only to how much benefit must be produced to justify it. Under sufficient pressure, any action can be framed as necessary. History offers no shortage of warnings here. Policies justified in the name of the greater good have enabled repression, abuse, and atrocity. When individuals are viewed primarily as units in a calculation, their moral standing becomes conditional. Their protection depends on whether they improve the totals. The categorical response arises precisely to resist this slide. By insisting that some actions are forbidden regardless of outcome, it establishes moral boundaries that power cannot easily cross. It places limits on what may be done to a person, even in the name of saving others. It treats individuals not as variables, but as bearers of rights and dignity. This approach has shaped another side of modern life. Constitutional protections, human rights doctrines, and prohibitions against torture and murder reflect categorical commitments. They are designed not to maximize welfare, but to constrain action. They say, in effect, that some things are not up for trade. But categorical reasoning also carries costs. It can appear rigid in the face of catastrophe. It can demand restraint even when restraint leads to worse outcomes. It can seem indifferent to numbers, blind to scale, unwilling to adapt to emergency. This is why, in practice, societies rarely adopt one framework to the exclusion of the other. Instead, they live uneasily between them. We invoke consequences when we allocate resources, plan policy, and manage risk. We invoke principles when we draw red lines, defend rights, and condemn certain acts no matter their utility. We oscillate between these modes, often without acknowledging the tension. The trolley problem forces that tension into the open. It reveals that our moral lives are shaped by competing intuitions that cannot be fully harmonized. We want to save as many lives as possible. We also want to respect each person as inviolable. When these commitments collide, no formula resolves the conflict. This realization is unsettling. It undermines the hope that moral reasoning can deliver certainty in every case. It suggests that moral judgment is not merely a matter of applying rules, but of navigating conflicts between values that matter deeply and cannot always be reconciled. This is why philosophy, at its best, does not offer comfort. It disturbs. It destabilizes. It takes what we think we already know and forces us to see it from a new angle. It reveals that our confidence often rests on unexamined assumptions, and that once examined, those assumptions may not survive intact. There is a personal risk here. Once familiar moral beliefs are made strange, they cannot simply be returned to their original state. Self-knowledge, once gained, cannot be undone. To reflect seriously on these questions is to accept that one's moral intuitions may be partial, inconsistent, or incomplete. There is also a political risk. Citizens who reflect critically on moral principles may become less comfortable with slogans, less satisfied with easy justifications, less willing to accept claims of necessity at face value. They may become harder to govern, more skeptical of authority, more demanding of justification. This is not always welcomed. Even in ancient Athens, this danger was recognized. Socrates was warned that philosophy pursued too far would make people impractical, detached, disruptive.
It would distance them from convention and unsettle settled beliefs. There was truth in the warning. Philosophy does distance us from the familiar. It does make the obvious questionable. It does erode the comfort of inherited assumptions. But this distancing is not a defect. It is the point.
The alternative is not stability, but unexamined habit. Not certainty, but complacency. One tempting response to this discomfort is skepticism, the idea that because these questions are difficult and unresolved, they are ultimately a matter of personal opinion. That since philosophers have debated them for centuries without agreement, there is nothing more to say. This response offers relief. It allows us to step back, to avoid the strain of judgment, to treat moral disagreement as insoluble. But skepticism does not free us from moral responsibility. Even when we refuse to reflect, we still act. Even when we deny moral reasoning, we live by implicit answers. Every day we make choices that express commitments about harm, fairness, responsibility, and respect. The questions return whether we invite them or not. This is why moral philosophy endures. Not because it promises final answers, but because the questions it raises are unavoidable. They arise wherever human beings must act under conditions of conflict, scarcity, and uncertainty, which is to say, everywhere. The aim of this inquiry is not to tell us once and for all whether to turn the trolley. It is to awaken awareness of the moral frameworks we already use, often without noticing them, to reveal their strengths and their limits, to make us more attentive to what we are doing when we justify harm, excuse necessity, or draw moral lines. The story that began with a runaway trolley ends with us, with our judgments, with our institutions, with our willingness to ask not only what works, but what is right. That restlessness, the refusal to settle too quickly, the insistence on reflection, even when it is uncomfortable, is not a problem to be solved. It is the condition of moral life itself.